Okay, hello everyone. So I believe this is our last week of class. So this week we will be finishing off with chapter 6, which is regression discontinuity design. I was not planning on doing a review class on Wednesday just because you guys all have access to the recordings of every previous class. So I think it's on you to go review those on your own since you just have that benefit this semester. But I am happy to answer any questions that you might have about the final, either this class or the last class. Um, I haven't written it yet, but I do have a rough idea of what it will look like. So if you guys have any questions about the final, let me know. Um, so yeah, you guys should have all submitted your referee report on Friday. That was due. So I will be working on grading those throughout this week. Hopefully it won't take longer than a week. It is a bit more time consuming just because everyone has their own paper and I need to go back and compare it to the actual academic paper. So I definitely want to be more careful and take more time with these. So don't be stressed if you don't get a grade back right away this week. And just remember that you have your last assignment 3, due on June 14th, right? So that will be due this upcoming week. Make sure you do it. It can be submitted in groups of 2 again, so the same as last time. Just make sure I only need 1 email per group and make sure both of your names are on the PDF file name and also within the document. Okay. And then yeah, that should be it. We're still waiting on the date for the final exam. Those haven't been posted yet from what I've been told, so hopefully we find out sooner or later. Either way, it's going to be, you guys will have like 2 days to work on it, so the timing shouldn't matter too much. Okay, and so it will be open book. Are there any questions before we get started with the actual lecture for today? Nada. Okay. Awesome. So let's get started. Oh, wait, chat. Will it include a coding part? No, there's not going to be any coding on your final exam. It's all going to be written. So, I mean, if you think about the assignments that you guys have done, there's been some questions about methodologies or assumptions of models, whether you think interpreting estimates and whether there might be overstated or observed bias. It'll more be questions around that, so you won't have to do any actual data analysis for the final exam. Entonces, vamos. Will you upload the solutions of the assignments, please? Yeah, I can. I mean, I don't have fully done out solutions. I do have some code, so I can try and work on those. I don't think they would be overly relevant though, since the assignments won't be on coding as much. And then for the each individual's assignment, I did make some comments on where you lost marks. So yeah, I don't know how much of help that would be, but I can try and give an outline for those. Okay, so yeah, so the last 2 components that you guys are missing are the assignment 3, which is 15%, and then the final exam, which is 30% of your grade. Okay, so you're almost there. Okay. So let's start with this chapter 6 again. Can you repeat, please? Repeat what part? I just said that you have your assignment 3 due on the 14th of June, so that's next week. So make sure you do that. You can submit it in groups of 2. And then the final exam, we do not have a date for it yet, but I think the faculty will be posting the date soon. But for you guys, I don't know what other professors are doing, but just because this is an online course this semester, I think it makes more sense to do an open book exam. You guys will have a couple days to submit it. Um, so that's what it's going to be. And it's not going to have any coding. It's just going to be written answers based on what you've seen in the slides for the whole semester. And also the questions will be sort of similar to what you've seen in assignments and maybe something a bit like a referee report, but obviously not too long. So yeah, I haven't written the final exam yet, so I can't give you guys too much information on that. Okay, so where we left off was we had just finished discussing the sharp regression discontinuity design, and we're about to move on to the fuzzy RD. Okay, so just to review, who can anyone remind me of any of these assumptions? Oh, sorry. No, okay. No, there's no date yet for the final exam. I'm still waiting on the econ faculty to let us know. Okay. So once I find out, you guys will find out. Okay, so can anyone remind me of the assumptions that we need for a regression discontinuity design to obtain causality? So remember, oh yeah, sorry.
Oh, sorry. You have to be in the window of causality. Like,
Yeah, so what you're saying is that basically the principle of a regression discontinuity design is that we're using some random cutoff of a index or whatever continuous variable to compare the outcomes between two groups. So in order to avoid selection bias, we need to look within a relatively close range to make sure that these two groups are as comparable as possible. Yeah, what else? So what do we have to have regarding the cutoff of the continuous variable? So for example, say we're thinking of the poverty index. So any household under a poverty index score of 50 is accepting, or they will be eligible for this program. So what does this cutoff have to have in order for us to be able to have causality? I know it was felt like a long weekend. Okay, well, one is that the cutoff score, so say we chose 50, that has to be randomly chosen, right? So we can't specifically have a reason to choose 50 rather than 51, for example, because that randomness or the arbitrary aspect of choosing the cutoff is what allows us to use the as good as random assumption, right? So we're saying a regression discontinuity design is as good as random, as in it's almost as good as it's as good as a randomized experiment when we randomly choose what our cutoff is, because we assume people just above the cutoff score will be very close in characteristics to people just below, right? So then we can say the only difference between the two groups would be the treatment effect of accessing the program. What else is important about the cutoff? Okay, math. Y'all are quiet today. Okay, so another one would be that we have to have a unique cutoff score, right? So if we use this 50 poverty index score for the program of interest, but it was the exact same cutoff score for another program that the same eligible group would then receive, then we don't have the unique channel of causality needed for our program, because we can't differentiate the treatment effect of interest compared to the treatment effect that probably occurs from this other program that has the same cutoff score, right? So you need the condition that the cutoff score is unique to this program that you're evaluating. What else has to
Sorry,
be?
I have a question.
Yeah.
So what happens if graphically your sample doesn't show discontinuity, but when you regress the all the model, you have like significant values or estimates?
Insignificant or significant?
Significant.
So if you're doing a regression discontinuity design and you have reason to think it would be a discontinuous jump based on some cutoff, um, it would be the case that if there was a significant difference, there would be a discontinuous jump. It's just about the problem there might be that you're estimating one linear relationship rather than two. So to be able to show the discontinuous jump, you need to have two linear relationships. So one line on the left side of the cutoff and one on the right, right? Because they're going to be two different functions, which are determined by what your x is, right? So there's a much higher probability of entering the program, for example, when you're within the eligibility range. So then there should be a significant effect and there should be a discontinuous jump graphically as long as you're estimating two lines, not just one.
Oh, okay, thank you.
Yeah. Okay, so back to the assumptions. Let's just go back to the slides because, okay, here they are. Okay, so the one other thing about the cutoff is that it must rank people in a continuous or smooth way. So we need a continuous variable for our x variable. So for example, poverty score, which we talked about, or a test score, or even age, these variables that have very many values. So then we can find a very close group of people around the cutoff. So we can look at, for example, people with poverty indexes between 55 to 60 and just people under the cutoff, right? So it needs to be a continuous variable. When you have discrete variables such as the highest level of education, so whether it's secondary, university, a master's, things that are very categorical like that, you really cannot implement a regression discontinuity because you don't have people close to the threshold, right? They're very big jumps, and so a lot of other things might differ between the two groups then, and that's how you obtain selection bias in your estimate. So the continuous variable for the running variable is very important here. So the other assumption that we missed was that there must be a clearly defined cutoff score. So if we say that the cutoff rule for this program is 50 on the poverty index, we actually need that to be the case so that people under this poverty index are accessing the program more than people above. If there's no clear distinction between who is actually eligible to the program based on this cutoff, then it's not informative. So we need an informative cutoff score to be relevant and to be able to analyze the program. Okay, and then as I said, we need the cutoff to be unique to the program of interest because if there's two programs with the same cutoff score, we won't be able to distinguish the two effects because then you can assume that your treatment group that you're looking at is treated also by another program. So that's really harmful and you guys should be watchful of that. It can happen with government programs especially. Okay, and then the final one that's very important is that the score of a particular individual or unit cannot be manipulated by whether it's the actual people, like the treated group, or whether it's the administrators of the program or politicians, etc. Usually would be the individuals because they have the most interest in it. But what would be the problem if people were able to actually determine their own score? Okay, so obviously, for example, the poverty index, say I have a poverty index of 51, but I know that there's this program available for households with a poverty score of 50 or under. So maybe there's incentive for me to lie about my report. So I can say, oh, well, I only made X amount of money, or report less income than you actually have, so that you can move down on the poverty index and access this treatment group, right? So there is incentive to do that. And the problem with that is, yes, Susanna said it, it's not random anymore, because then you have the whole self-selection problem into a program that we talked about in Unit 2 that's very harmful. When people self-select themselves into the program, you're creating bias again, because then they're probably systematically different in their characteristics for whatever reason why they want to enter the program. And then you're not also getting a valid counterfactual group, right? Because these people that should be in the control group at the other side of the cutoff are now pushing themselves into the treatment group. So your control group's gonna not be valid counterfactual. So we really don't want manipulating of the individual X at all. So um, whether it's test score outcome, whether it's income, any self-reporting variable can be definitely problematic with manipulation. So be wary if you're using a cutoff that relies on self-reported data. So one example, like we talked about the test score, remember the example where we said there was a standardized exam, and if you get above 80%, you would access the scholarship. And then you could say, well, obviously that's manipulation, because the harder you study, the higher grade you'll get. But the thing is, since it's a standardized exam, people don't know exactly what grade they need to get the 80%, because it's all standardized, so it's relative to how everyone else does. So you can't individually determine your own grade really, because it depends on everyone else. So that's why that can still be valid for a cutoff score. Are there any questions about the assumptions of a difference in difference? Or not, difference in difference, regression discontinuity design. I'm living in the past. Okay, so I think the assumptions are pretty straightforward, and also the interpretation is pretty straightforward as well. So recall that if we have a discontinuous jump in the outcome, so here, A to B, this would be the impact. This would be our impact of interest, right? So A minus B, for example. Actually, yeah, A minus B in this case, because we're saying people below 50, this was the farm example, where if you had a small or medium-sized farm, you got access to this price subsidy. So it was any farm with under 50 hectares. So then the treatment effect is A minus B. And why can we just take a difference in means here? Why is that valid? You guys, why do you think just doing A minus B at this cutoff is a good estimation?
I mean, it can be because of the similarity between the groups in the cutoff. So
Yeah,
you can directly.
exactly. So it's the setup of a regression discontinuity design, right? Because we're saying that, well, this cutoff is random. How did they choose 50 hectares? They kind of chose it randomly. So then people just around or farms just around this cutoff are going to be very similar. So farms with 49 hectares of land are going to be similar to farms with 51 hectares of land. And that could be in terms of whatever characteristics matter for a farm, like output, number of workers, type of crops, all of these different descriptive characteristics. So it's basically the same as having a balance table for the randomization. Remember how you want to check that the covariates are balanced, and that ensures validity of a randomization, and you take difference in means. This is exactly the same. That's why they say it's as good as randomization, because this cutoff is random. So then when you look at two groups right next to it, they should be identical. And so that's why we can take the difference in means, same as in randomization, because we assume that when we look within that small window of comparability, we have that causality, so there's going to be no selection bias. But if we were to compare the whole population below the cutoff to the whole population above the cutoff, then we probably would obtain some selection bias in our estimates, right? Because farms that only have 20 hectares of land are probably quite different from farms with 70 or 80 in terms of equipment, productive ability, number of crops, amount of land, all of these different factors, right? So the real causality for a regression discontinuity design is looking within a small window. Okay. So what about our inference now? So to make inference, right, what am I saying? I'm saying that in terms of policy recommendations, for what population can we speak about? So we say we find this effect size A minus B. Can we say this is the average treatment effect for the whole population? This is a yes or no question. Do you guys think that we can, from this estimate A minus B, can we find the average treatment effect for all farms? Yes, one yes. Everyone agree yes? No, I'm not sure. Okay, so good. I'm glad we talked about this then. No, you do not have the average treatment effect for all farms, any size, because this is a very specific inference window. We're only considering the difference in outcomes between farms, say from like 45 to 55 hectares. So we cannot make inference for really large farms or really small farms because they're different in characteristics. So likely they would respond to treatment differently than this specific group. When you look at a really specific group like this, you do not typically have causal inference for the whole population. So this is called, this is a I guess, this is like a localized treatment effect. So it's local within this basically comparability window. So we can't make inference for large farms. We can't make inference for small farms. We can only say something about these medium-sized farms. Okay, so remember the, where was it? Sorry. Okay, yeah, remember this picture? Um, the difference between a sharp RD and a fuzzy RD is that within the sharp RD, we have perfect compliance of the treatment assignment, right? So if you are basically within the eligibility window, so say we're looking at the below 50 poverty index, then everyone is treated, and anyone above is not treated. So that's perfect compliance, and that means that the treatment status is deterministic of the X variable, so the poverty index. Okay, so you can see how this function is deterministic because what your X is, your baseline poverty index, exactly will tell you whether you're treated or not. So the sharp RD is deterministic. The fuzzy RD is not perfectly deterministic because we have incomplete compliance. What does incomplete compliance mean? We talked about it with randomization. Um, Basically, we have the problem that some people who are assigned to the treatment group, right? So if you're under 50, you should be treated. Not everyone is receiving treatment, but some are, most are, right? It's pretty close to 100%. So it's almost full compliance, but it's still incomplete. And then on the control side, when you're above 50 poverty index, you're not supposed to access the program. But there is, for some reason, some probability of accessing this program. So what can we do then? Well, we don't want to use the sharp RD methodology of just comparing difference in means. Why is that? Why don't we want to compare difference in means then? Oops. Come on, you guys. This is the answer to every question. What would be the problem of comparing to difference in means here? Selection bias. Yes, exactly. That's always the answer. So yeah, it's always selection bias because what we talked about this too with randomization is that the initial assignment of the randomization rule is random, right? But afterwards, if any people decide to select in or out of treatment status, that's not random, right? So the problem is here that we said, okay, well, randomly we choose that any household under 50 is going to access this program. And then anyone above the poverty score 50 will not. So that's random, but then there's some groups in the treatment side that decide not to take up treatment for some reason. You can see that as you get closer to 50, obviously the households are more rich, so maybe they feel less of a need to participate. And then on the other side, although the participation is low, there are some households close to the cutoff that do somehow participate for some reason. So if we were just to take difference in means, then it wouldn't be accurate. There would be bias because there will be some people, basically non-takers in the treatment group and always takers in the control group. So they're probably going to be systematically different from the average complier, right? Going back to the always takers, never takers, and compliers. We always only want to consider the compliant subpopulation because they're the ones that will actually be incentivized to take on the program when they're offered it, and then they won't otherwise. Always takers are going to take it no matter what, and they might have difference in motivation or other unobservable factors. Same for the never takers. So what did we do last time in the randomization when we did not have perfect compliance? What was our strategy? Late. Yes. Instrumenting. Yes. Exactly. So we did the local average treatment effect, right? So we did use that's an instrument variable strategy. So the instrument variable we used was first the initial assignment to the treatment group, and we use that to instrument for the actual treatment effect, right? So this is going to be something similar actually, because we only want to account for the compliant subpopulation. So we're going to use the same walled estimate as we did before with the ITT TOT estimation. So I'll show that in a second. Wait. An incomplete
Sorry, I
compliance.
have a question.
Yeah, go.
So what happens if you have a dummy variable as dependent variable? It is possible to make RD, or it's kind of complicated?
Yeah, it is possible. So for example, like I think one of the examples we talked about was the test score on looking at whether you completed college or not. So that was the dummy variable, and it's just, I mean, it is definitely possible. It's just it would be interpreted as the probability of completing college given that you're basically given this scholarship. So you just, I guess the interpretation is a bit different. You will think of it as a probability that your dummy variable equals to 1.
Okay, thanks. But you don't have to make like logit or something like that.
No, no. Okay, and then another question in the comments is, can incomplete compliance be caused by manipulating the score? Or is it only when you are already labeled as no treatment and you find a way to get it? That's a good question. So they're kind of different because manipulating the score will actually make it seem like they should be in the treatment group, but they really shouldn't. So that's harder to detect because like when we look at the data, we'll think that they're in the treatment group, even if their true income is on the control side. So that's false reporting. So that's not exactly the same as imperfect compliance, because imperfect compliance could just be that we know that their poverty index is above the cutoff, so they shouldn't be there, but we see that they're treated. So incomplete compliance is definitely better to deal with because we can observe it, whereas manipulation is definitely harder to observe. So they're slightly different in that sense. No problem. Okay. So yeah, we just say that a fuzzy RD is, no, sorry, not fuzzy RDs. An RD is fuzzy if there's non-compliance on either side. So it can be on just the treatment side or just the control side or both. So when we have a fuzzy RD, we want to use the instrument variable approach to correct for the non-compliance. So we're going to exploit the discontinuity in the probability or expected value of treatment conditional on a covariate. So the covariate will be the running variable, for example, poverty score. So now we see that, for example, the probability that your treatment equals 1, if you're below the cutoff, isn't going to be exactly equal to 1 as in the sharp RD case. So it's going to be higher than on the other side, but it's not going to be perfectly 1 and 0. So there's going to have to be some sort of increase in probability from the control to treatment side. So that's just to make it informative, right? So if there's no difference in the probability of receiving treatment on either side of the cutoff, as one of our assumptions says, you need the cutoff to be informative for the treatment status. So if it's the case that there's no increase in probability from moving from the control side of the cutoff to the treatment side, then you don't have a useful regression discontinuity because you need that increase in probability of treatment. Okay, so let's let DI denote the treatment, same as before. Though here DI is no longer deterministically related to the threshold crossing rule. Remember we said before that when xi is greater than x0, we know for sure that DI equals 1, and then the other way would be DI equals 0. But this time we don't know, it's going to be some probability. So this time there's just a jump in the probability of treatment at the cutoff x0, so that the probability that you're treated, DI equals 1, given the poverty score, for example, whatever the running variable is, that's the xi here. That's going to be g0, so some function of xi when xi is below the cutoff, and then g1 of xi when xi is above x0. So they're just saying that there's these two different functions that are going to explain the relationship between receiving treatment and your poverty index score, or whatever the running variable is. And the thing is that these two functions, so on either side of the cutoff, there's going to be two functions, right? They cannot be the same, and there should be that one function is greater than the other. So for example, we want there to be an increase in probability when you're moved to the treatment side of the cutoff. So for example, when we talked about the poverty index score and we said any household with a poverty index score less than 50 should be treated, then we expect that side to have a higher probability of receiving treatment than the other. So that's all that this is saying really, and just that it's some relationship now between the treatment status and the X, the poverty index score. So it's not perfectly 1 and 0. Is that clear, or is there any questions regarding that? Am I talking too fast? Not really. Okay. Thanks. Okay, so these two functions, so GO, XI, and G1, can be anything. They can be anything as long as they're different. And the more different, I mean, the better in the sense that there's going to be more of a visible treatment effect. So we do want to see that discontinuous jump. So assume that G1 X0 is greater than G0 X0 for now. So then that means that if Xi is greater than X0, that means you're more likely to be treated. So this would be the case of the test score. Like for example, if you score above 80, you'll receive the scholarship. So that would be the above the cutoff, you're treated side. So that's what this is saying. And then we can write the relationship between the probability of treatment, so the probability of DI equals 1, and XI as the following. So the expected value of DI given XI, here, let's say test score, is the probability that DI equals 1 given your test score, is the relationship between your test score and your treatment status when you're below the cutoff. There's going to be some sort of initial relationship before the treatment effect, and then plus G1 xi minus GO xi tau I. So this is the difference between the two functions on either side of the cutoff. So this is going to be the point of discontinuity, and that would actually be the treatment effect of interest, because you know that there's some initial relationship between test scores and basically receiving treatment, right, to begin with. And so then when you difference the two lines, that's how you find the treatment effect. Wait. Yes. Okay, so they're not treatment effect because that's just determining the difference in probability of getting treated, right? So this is just looking at the probability of receiving treatment based on what your X is. So this doesn't address causality yet, my bad. So then we're going to do a simple, basically walled estimation as we've done before for the instrument variable strategy. So remember how the walled estimator divides the reduced form regression by the first stage. So the reduced form regression would be what's an example? So that you know that there's two different functions we care about. The basically how X determines our outcome and how X determines our treatment status, right? So treatment status isn't perfectly deterministic by our X. There's some probability that our treatment status will equal 1 based on what our X is. So since we only want to consider the compliant subpopulation, we want to rescale such that we're basically only want to look at the probability of receiving treatment when you are in the treatment group, minus the probability of receiving treatment when you're in the control group, and that leaves us with the proportion of compliance units, I guess. This is the formula. I mean, it does look very similar to what we saw in the IV section, but it is a bit different because this time we're considering X around a cutoff, right? So for example, here we see that it's actually the limit for delta goes to 0. And don't let this scare you, it's just we're saying that, remember how we talked about on Monday, I guess, yeah, because we had Vadim on Wednesday. So delta is this arbitrary distance from your cutoff, and we're going to use that as the neighborhood of validity that we look within. So we're considering some randomly small distance away from our cutoff, which is delta. So we're just saying as delta goes to 0, because we want to think of a really small value of delta, right? We're looking within that window of comparability. And so it'll be the expected value of our outcome, given that xi is greater than x0, but still within the window of comparability. So x0 less than x0 plus delta. And then you subtract the other side of the cutoff, right, the control group. So the expected value of your outcome, given that your xi is below the cutoff, but still within the window on the left-hand side. So x0 less than delta is still bigger than our xi. So that's our reduced form, right? How our x explains our y. And then we rescale by the first stage regression, which is how the x determines the treatment status. So the expected value of your treatment, given that your xi is above the cutoff and therefore the treatment side, but still within the window of comparability. So it's less than x0 plus delta. And then you subtract the expected value of di, given that you're below the cutoff, but still within the window. So still bigger than x0 minus delta. And so you can see how this is treatment minus control, rescaling for the probability of treatment for the treatment group minus the probability of treatment for the control group. And then that will give us the causal effect of interest. So the value question, for the values of x that are closest to the right and left of the cutoff, yeah, so this delta is like called bandwidth selection, so we don't actually have a number. It really does depend on each sample and how much data you'll have around the cutoff to determine what your optimal bandwidth is. So we don't really know in practice exactly what the delta should be. It goes kind of case by case basis. So yeah, we're just saying somewhat close to the cutoff. So we're not including the full range of test scores in this example. It would just be within some window. But we don't specify what that would be yet. Okay, are there any other questions on this Wald equation? Okay, awesome. So you can see how this utilizes the non-parametric design of RD because we're using this delta, right? So we're saying we're not parameterizing it with, what you may call it, polynomials. Instead, we're just considering within a small window so that we can estimate a linear relationship, right? We're just taking difference in mean between the the right-hand side of the cutoff minus the left. And then you just rescale by the first stage. So we're not worrying about parameterizing it here. So yeah, therefore the equation 12 is the Wald estimator using, I don't know why it's TR. Oh. What did I say TI is? Oh, I don't know why I changed it. Okay, so TI equals 1 if xi is greater than x0. So we're saying that is a basically instrument for the treatment status within this delta neighborhood of x0. So we're saying that Ti is this dummy variable. It's equal to 1 when your xi is greater than x0. So that's the treatment side. But recall that we don't have perfect compliance. So Ti doesn't perfectly tell us what Di is, but there's going to be some positive relationship, right? So people who have a test score greater than 80 are going to be more likely to get the scholarship than people below. So it's the same as the intent to treat effect on the treatment of the treated, because recall that the same thing for randomization was that people assigned to the treatment group, not everyone's going to take it up, but they're going to be more likely to take it up. This is the same thing. People who are on the right side of the cutoff, for example, not everyone might take the treatment, but they're going to be much more likely. So we want to use that change in probability as the instrument variable. Okay, so remember that we're not only now considering local validity in terms of around the cutoff, we also now have the local average treatment effect. Do you guys remember what the local average treatment effect will give us in terms of inference? How is the local average treatment effect different from an average treatment effect? Um, the effect for the compliance sample. Yeah, exactly. So the local average treatment effect gives us the average treatment effect for the compliant subpopulation, right? So we only consider the compliers. So we're moving always takers and never takers from the sample, or at least the probability of being an always taker, never taker. So we have the local average treatment effect, but do we have the local average treatment effect for the whole sample? Can we say for all test takers, this is the local average treatment effect? Tough question. What do you guys think? Yes or no? It's the local average treatment effect for, okay, yeah, so we have the local average treatment effect, which we know is the average treatment effect for the compliance subpopulation. So can we say that with this regression discontinuity estimate, we have the weight for the whole sample size, so for all of the test takers? Or is it only relevant around the cutoff? Take the weight for all the, yes, sample? Yeah, so same as before, it's only relevant for our window of comparability, so our small sample size. So we can't say, for example, if we have this test score cutoff of 80, and we use this walled estimate, so we have a local average treatment effect, we cannot say that this effect is true for the whole test score size. So we can't say it's true from 0 to 100. It would probably only be true from about 75 to 85, depending on what the bandwidth is. And so that's to say that we can't assume that these people with very different grades would have similar treatment effects to the sample that we looked at. So this is even more local than the local average treatment effect or the regression discontinuity alone, because the fuzzy RD is not only a late, but it's also local within the basically bandwidth window. So it's very, very specific. Yeah, it says right here, the wald for the fuzzy RD captures the causal effect on the compliers defined as individuals whose treatment status changed as we move the value of xi from just to the left of xo to just to the right. So we're just looking within a small range. We cannot say it's true for the whole sample. That's a careful thing to note. Okay, so yeah, as I said, this is a much more narrow window of inference than in a sharp RD because this instrument RD will be more localized in the sense that it's no longer valid for all observations close to the cutoff, but now it's also only representative of the subgroup of the population that is located close to the cutoff point and participates in the program only because of their eligibility criteria, not because they would have anyways. Okay. Okay, so let's take our break here. I'll see you guys in 10 minutes. Oh, we got a question. So can we get the effect for the complete sample with an RD? No, never. We can only find the effect size for the smaller window of whatever your bandwidth is, so around the cutoff. And that's just because when you move further away from the cutoff, you have more selection bias and a lot more differences in characteristics between the left-hand side and the right-hand side. So you can't say that they're similar enough in groups that they would behave the same or respond the same to treatment. So they might be affected very differently. That's why you can't say that it's a average treatment effect for everyone. No problem. Okay. Break for 10 minutes until 6:07, 7:07. Okay, back at it. Are there any questions thus far? Great. So we're gonna start talking about manipulation for a moment. Recall that when we talked about manipulation before, um, we said that manipulation is when people can somehow control what their treatment status is, right? So we're mainly concerned about these people right around the cutoff score. If people just above the cutoff are somehow able to manipulate their score to push them into treatment, then that would be problematic because then we have selection bias by definition of self-selection. So we need to check and make sure it's there within our data. So for example, remember the fertilizer subsidy example we talked about on Monday, where these farms would receive a subsidy from the government if they had less than 50 hectares of land. So manipulation around the cutoff would occur if farm owners could alter land titles or misreport the basically size of their farm to gain eligibility. Um, so, or even like a farmer with 50.3 hectares of land might somehow find a way to sell half a hectare of land to qualify for the program if he thinks that the expected benefits for the subsidy are worth doing so, are worth selling this land. So you would be concerned that there's some sort of incentive if the program is really beneficial like that, that people are somehow willing to change their outcome or their running variable for. So you can definitely check this using a graph, which is the good thing. If there's manipulation of an eligibility criteria to gain treatment status, there will be typically bunching. So I'll show you what that looks like, but basically the distribution of households on the X variable, so for example, the hectares of land, we would expect it to be smooth. If there's bunching, we would expect to see a discontinuous jump at the cutoff. So for example, this graph of manipulation of the eligibility cutoff, you can see this is a distribution basically, the percentage of households for any given, well, this one's poverty index, so for any given poverty score. And so you can see on the left-hand side is the eligible population, and the right-hand side is the ineligible population. So you can see the distribution is very smooth, so there's no evidence of manipulation here. Whereas on the right-hand side, we do see evidence of manipulation because you expect this basically distribution of households to be smooth, yet we see a discontinuous jump such that right on the eligible side, there's a lot more households than just on the non-eligible side. So that's indicating to us that some households on the ineligible side were able to basically maybe report their baseline poverty index as lower than it should be to be able to gain treatment. If you're doing this in Stata, I think the command is like McCrary test, something like that. So that's what I would use personally. I think the Colonico package also has something of the just the distribution of your X, right? So that's all it is. Okay. Okay, I think we've talked about this quite a bit, but just remember that, okay, well, even without late, the closer you are to the cutoff, the more similar the units on either side of the cutoff will be. This is why the non-parametric estimation considers only a small neighborhood of delta around the cutoff. So that's just important for internal validity because if you're comparing a large group for the treatment and control, the further away from the cutoff you get, the further away from the random component you are. There's like more likely to be systematic differences. So non-parametric definitely is preferred for that reason. So when you do get extremely close to the cutoff, theoretically, and oftentimes in practice, the units on either side of the cutoff will be very, very similar, so that your comparison will be as good as if you had chosen the treatment and comparison groups using the random assignment strategy. So this is as good as random, basically the explanation for that. So for this reason, they call a regression discontinuity design a quasi-natural experiment because the cutoff point is considered random and therefore people just above and below the cutoff should be nearly identical. We talked about that quite a bit. We also talked about the assumptions. Remember that we need the unique cutoff score, we need a random cutoff score, and no manipulation or bunching. And we can't generalize the estimates for people far away from the cutoff score. I said that. So when we're looking at the treatment effect, we cannot make extrapolation to the whole population, only those directly around the cutoff score. So that means we really don't have that much external validity for this estimation. So some people think that's a bad thing because, you know, you always want experiments to be useful for policy implementation, right? So if you can only use this for a really small group of people, how informative is it to policy is the one problem that we can think of. So if the evaluation primarily seeks to answer the question, should the program exist or not in general, for example, the scholarship program, then the average treatment effect for the entire eligible population would be more relevant. So we don't really have the estimation that we want if we just want to know whether this program should exist or not, because we want to see how the people that basically don't have the program, how they would benefit from it. However, it can still be beneficial if we're thinking of it on the intensive margins. So basically, if the policy question is, should the program be cut or expanded at the margin? So basically, right around the cutoff, should we basically maybe for the test, for example, lower the cutoff so that more people can get treated? Or should we make the treatment group even smaller? So should we expand or contract the program? This question can be well answered with a regression discontinuity design because we're looking right around the cutoff so we can see what the impact is of the treatment on the treatment group right in this localized setting. So in terms of looking at the marginal effect, it's really good, but it's really not useful for an average treatment effect for the whole population. So it is beneficial and it does have its drawbacks, of course. Also, another more technical issue with regression discontinuity design would be that when we're looking within a small window around the cutoff, we're using less data, and that could raise challenges in terms of statistical power of the analysis, right? Because recall when we don't have enough people in our sample, we might not even be able to observe a treatment effect, even if it is there, just because we don't have enough data and there's too much noise, right? When you have very little data, you're going to have very large standard error terms because there's so much variation that you aren't able to capture a clear relationship. So obviously the ideal experiment or regression discontinuity would be we have thousands and thousands of observations around the cutoff in a really small area. Often that's not normally the case. And so there is some sort of trade-off between how much of a basically bandwidth you want to use or the window. Bandwidth and window, same thing, just bandwidth sounds fancy. So how much of a bandwidth you want to use and how much precision you can get, right? So obviously the larger the bandwidth, you'll have better precision, as in you can more accurately capture the relationship, you'll have smaller error terms, and the estimates will be more precise in general. However, you're more likely to pick up some sort of bias in your estimation the larger the bandwidth you use. So there's that trade-off between bias and precision here. Do you guys understand that trade-off between bias and precision, or should I go over it again? Okay, I think it's clear then. Oh, oh, someone replied. Please again. Okay, perfect. So I was just saying how we're talking about a more technical issue around the regression discontinuity design, specifically with a non-parametric estimation. Remember that we're considering only people around the cutoff within a window of delta, so a small neighborhood around the cutoff. That's good for eliminating selection bias because the closer we get to this random cutoff, the more likely these two groups will be very similar or identical. However, the closer we get to the cutoff, the less, basically the less data we include. The problem with that is that we run into issues with statistical power. So we might not even be able to detect effect when there is one. And then also we would have larger standard errors because we just have more noise when there's less observation. So we don't observe as clear of a relationship. So the good thing about using a larger bandwidth or including more data is that we have more precision in our estimates. So we have a clear picture of the relationship between the basically the two cutoffs and the outcome. However, the problem is the larger the bandwidth, the more bias we accept into our estimation because the further away you get from the cutoff, the more likely there are going to be noticeable differences between the two sides of the treatment and the control. So there is that trade-off between precision in your estimates. You don't want huge standard errors and you don't want noisy estimates, but also you don't want bias. So you do want to be careful about that. Of course, the problem in Stata is easily solved by RD robust, which is basically measures your regression discontinuity and chooses your optimal bandwidth for you. So they use some formula to minimize the mean squared errors, I believe. I think I get into that here, just to save you guys the boring equations for the semester. Okay, so yeah, to obtain sufficient statistical power when applying your regression discontinuity, you will need to choose a bandwidth around the cutoff score that includes sufficient amount of observations. In practice, we want to use as large of a bandwidth as possible while maintaining the balance and observed characteristics of the population above and below the cutoff, right? So we want them to be as similar as possible while including as much data as possible. Traditionally, authors used to just run the estimation several times using different bandwidth, check whether the estimates are sensitive to bandwidth choice. So for example, for the poverty index score, we know that the cutoff's at 50. You could say, considering only people with a score of 40 to 50, and then you could compare that to estimates from 45. Wait. Oh, I said that wrong. So 40 to 60, and then you could narrow the bandwidth from there from 45 to 55, and then even smaller, and see how those estimates compare. So that was considered like the ad hoc way of doing it. It's pretty random choosing the bandwidth size. Now it's a bit more easy because there's formulas that just tell you how big your bandwidth should be. So yeah, it is more challenging to choose this bandwidth traditionally. I think I just said that. Okay, so yeah, like I said, there's the trade-off between bias and precision. So yeah, as I said, in Stata, the RD robust package provides the point estimators, confidence interval estimators, bandwidth selectors, and automates the RD plots. It's super nice. They have it in R too. They have the same RD robust package in R, which is nice. In R also, there's more flexibility with how you make graphs, just so they look nicer, but I mean, just preference really. Okay, I was repeating myself. Okay, so now we're going to talk about this paper. We have like 20 minutes left, so we should be able to get through this. This is by Carpenter and Dobkin, and it's called The Effect of Alcohol Consumption on Mortality. So it's a regression discontinuity design using a minimum wage or minimum drinking age in the United States. I'm not sure if you guys have read this paper, but it's a pretty classic RD. So they're looking at how the minimum drinking age or how your drinking behavior affects the probability of basically death by car crashes. Okay, so yeah. The authors estimate the effect of alcohol consumption on mortality using, I think they look at different types of mortality, but they specifically care about like car crashes, I feel like, but maybe I'm remembering it wrong. So they're using the minimum drinking age in the United States, which is 21. So old, crazy. The authors want to know. That reminds me, when I was in Peru, I went to like just like a little store, and there was like 9-year-old kids buying beer for their parents. Like that would not happen in Canada. It just made me laugh. Like crazy. They're super strict here. You need like 3 pieces of ID to buy alcohol. It's insane. So, anyways, so the authors want to know if alcohol consumption by young adults increases mortality. So that's just death rate of a population. A role for the alcohol-related impairment in motor vehicle fatalities among youth is widely acknowledged. So, like, it's basically known that once young people start drinking, there's more car crash. So whether it be from being drunk and driving or whatever reason. But how are these two related? Like, we want to know what the causal effect is. So research in biology, psychology, and medicine have identified several different mechanisms. So for example, in the laboratory setting, alcohol consumption has been shown to reduce inhibition. So you're more risky, you're more aggressive, your motor skills aren't as good, you have blurred vision. So, I mean, I'm sure all of you have drank alcohol before, you know what it's like. You don't have as good self-control. So those are basically the reasons that the authors um, basically attribute drinking to more car collisions. So there's an obvious set of physical and behavioral consequences of alcohol consumption. So therefore, it's not really surprising alcohol has been strongly associated not only with motor vehicle fatalities, but also other types of mortality. So the authors really want to understand the causal link between youth alcohol consumption and mortality, which is relevant for public policy, given that over half of young adults drink and about 1/3 drink heavily. And heavily is 5 or more drinks in one night. That makes me laugh. Okay, so providing precise estimates of the strength of this causal relationship between alcohol consumption and mortality is actually really complicated. And that's because we have unobserved heterogeneity among individuals, which is likely related to alcohol consumption and also determines mortality. God bless universities. Yeah. So, what do you think is the issue with causal inference? If we were just to run a standard OLS regression of drinking alcohol on motor vehicle accidents, what do you guys think the problem is there? Would we get a causal effect of the drinking on the motor vehicle accident, or would other things be affecting our estimate?
I mean, so it's relating a person dying from motor vehicle accidents to the average of alcohol he drinks or something like that.
They use a bunch of different types of alcohol consumption, so like mainly intensity though, so drinking like heavily, for example, or frequency of drinks per week.
Yeah, I mean, if it's not like in the same day, you cannot like find causality, right? In the same day of the accident.
Oh yeah, true. I understand. Like you're saying, well, so yeah, that's the thing. So the problem really is, yeah, you guys are in the comments. It would be extremely biased, many omitted variables. Yes, but you guys need to be more specific. So what would the omitted variables be? Well, maybe it's the case that people who drink are more risk taking anyways. So it's not that the alcohol is causing car accidents, it's that risky people are drinking a lot but also driving, so they'll take more risks driving and be more likely to get in an accident regardless. So we're scared it's this unobservable bias that is actually just people that are risky will drink more and also um, drive worse or more riskily. Also, it could just be another one is your discount rate of the future. People who care a lot more about their future probably don't drink as much because they want to be healthy and they'll probably drive more safely and follow the rules and speed limits, whereas people don't care much about their future. Same thing, they'll probably drink a lot more, not make as good of choices on the weekends, and then also be more likely to speed, drive aggressively, all of these other things. So that's the main omitted variable bias that we're concerned about. So yeah, as I said, young adults who are more likely to drink may be different from those who choose not to drink. For example, they have a higher future discount rate, so they're more willing to take up riskier decisions and behave recklessly. So the authors estimate the causal effect of alcohol consumption on mortality using an RD. So this is going to use the minimum legal drinking age to produce a sharp difference in alcohol access for young adults on either side of the 21 age cutoff, which is actually like really tight in the United States. It's pretty strict though. So since the observed and unobserved determinants of alcohol consumption and mortality are likely to trend smoothly across the age 21 threshold, the authors use these estimates of basically just the discontinuous jump in alcohol consumption and mortality to identify the effect of alcohol consumption on mortality, specifically for these young adults. Okay, so they're saying that other factors would be smooth across 21. So individual characteristics, how risky you are, any sort of behavior thing, those should all be consistent across 21. The only thing that should really change is the fact that you're legally allowed to drink. So prior literature has used basically change in minimum legal drinking ages in the 1970s and 80s. So they used the difference in difference design. So based on the fact that the majority of US states experimented with lower drinking ages of 18, 19, and 20 before the federal regulation in 1984 required all states to be 21 years old. So studies treated this as a natural experiment and comparing between states with lower age requirements compared to the states that were always 21. Um, the only problem is that there's really not a good counterfactual for this one because probably states that are willing to drop their minimum legal drinking age might have different priorities than states that have a higher legal drinking age. So I don't think they find good pre-trends on these estimations, so they're not really super trustworthy. And so yeah, overall, based on this literature, there hasn't been any good consensus regarding whether or how much of the change in drinking age affected youth alcohol consumption. Um, yeah, I said this already. Um, Also, like the speed at which states chose to comply with the federal law of bringing up your minimum drinking age might be non-random as well. So like states that don't care as much will be slower to implement it in their state than others. And so it might not be actually a good, clear before and after difference in difference. Um, Okay, so this is a better strategy because um, the RD design using the minimum legal drinking age has been set at 21 for 2 decades. And so they can be more confident that the results aren't determined by changes in policy. So they estimate the reduced form impact of the minimum legal drinking age on alcohol consumption and then mortality they use both parametric and non-parametric estimations. So their data comes from the National Health Interview Survey from 1997 to 2005. Okay, so they're looking at the individual level drinking rates for teenagers. And so to evaluate the impact of alcohol consumption on mortality, the authors use this data on mortality details from this period, so 1997 to 2004. And they use population estimates from the census to convert mortality counts into rates. So they're basically looking at rates. They don't have a panel data. So like this individual turned 21. Did they get into a car crash? They don't have data like that. They just have individual level drinking data and they know when they turned 21. And then they have to use a separate data set to look at mortality rates. So they're looking at like whatever district level or state level mortality rate. So for the analysis, they're focusing on young adults aged 19 to 22. So that would be their bandwidth, right? So if the cutoff is your birthday or your age, I couldn't think of the word age. Your age equals 21, they have only the window between 19 to 22. That's like 2 years on each side, right? 19, 20, and then 21, 22. So this NHIS is a survey of stratified random sample of the US population, and it's asking respondents a variety of health outcome and different behavior questions, such as alcohol consumption. So yeah, they have data on this alcohol consumption from the full period. And within that, they know the exact birth date and the interview date of the respondent. So this allows them to calculate exactly what age the respondent was at the time of the survey. So that's really important. You need to know where people are with respect to the cutoff to be able to do this, right? So you need to say, this is when they turn 21. So yeah, they ask a bunch of questions about alcohol consumption, such as measures of drinking participation. So whether they have consumed 12 or more drinks in their lifetime, whether they've consumed 12 or more drinks in 1 year, whether they have engaged in any heavy drinking in the previous year. And remember, heavy drinking is more than 5 drinks at one time. So then they also examine 2 different measures of drinking frequency and intensity. So for frequency, so the percentage of days on which an individual drinks, an individual drinks. So how many days in a year do you drink? And then the percentage of days which an individual engages in heavy drinking. Okay, so for percentage of days which an individual has a drink, you could just have 1 beer every day, and you would have 100% for that dummy variable. Or no, it's not a dummy, for that variable. And then the other variable only cares about the intensity drinking. So if you have a heavy drinking day, you need to have at least 5 beers. So that's just 1. So the percentage of heavy drinking days in a year. So those are 2 slightly different variables. Especially because the authors think that heavy drinking would matter more to basically road vehicle mortality than the necessarily days of the year drinking. So they find 2 problems with using this data in estimating the change in alcohol consumption. The first is that the questions on alcohol consumption typically refer to the prior 12 months. So they say, in the past 12 months, how many days have you drank in a year, something like that. So this implies that in the first months after turning 21, their reference period is largely based on their 20th year, right? Which is problematic because we want to know what their drinking patterns are when they're 21, not when they're 20. Because when they're 20, they're ineligible to drink, right? So the only good thing that they find is that despite being asked about their behavior over the past year, respondents can choose to report on their alcohol consumption within the past year, the past month, or the past week. And luckily for the authors, 71% of the respondents chose to refer to either the past week or the past month. So that's good because then they have that basically window or the data for drinking when you're 21, which is what they need. Okay, the other problem is that alcohol consumption might be underreported due to this desirability bias. No one wants to say that they were drinking when they were illegal, like when they weren't allowed to drink. So there might be some lying about true drinking behavior. That would be problematic because there could be a discontinuous change in the desirability bias at 21. So basically what we're saying is that when you're 20, you might lie about what you drink because it's legal, but when you're 21, there's no incentive to lie. So then you might get this large jump in drinking behavior, and it would be due to this desirability bias, not because of an actual treatment effect. So that could be problematic. So the authors spend time arguing why they shouldn't be too concerned about this. Or whether the change that they see is not only due to that desirability bias. For one, they say there is a large discrete increase in alcohol-related deaths at age 21. So if there wasn't an increase in drinking, why would there be an increase in alcohol-related deaths? That wouldn't make sense at all. That's indirect evidence, but it is very compelling because, I mean, it makes sense. You wouldn't be like, why would people suddenly start dying at 21 rather than 20 if drinking didn't change at all? So we do believe there is an increase in drinking behavior at 21 based on this. And then also the authors find that a majority of younger adults under age 21 have reported that they consumed at least 12 drinks in their lifetime, and that there is essentially no change in reported lifetime drinking participation at 21. So they're saying in terms of lifetime participation, it's basically the same between 20 and 21-year-olds, which makes them feel better that there is honest reporting. But, you know, it's like really not testable, so they can argue that, but we can never be super confident. So yeah, they do think there might be some of this desirability bias, but they don't think it's really driving the true effect. They think it's mostly is driven by the change in observed drinking patterns. Okay, so then the mortality data, we're running out of time. Holy smokes. I guess that's fine. So the mortality data comes from NCHS, which is basically confidential national mortality detail files, and includes this, basically descendants. I don't know why I can't speak today. So people's date of birth and date of death. So they have this data from 1997 to 2004, and they use it basically to be able to categorize the type of deaths there are. So they have deaths due to internal causes and deaths due to external causes. So basically they're only interested in external causes, which consist of homicides, suicides, motor vehicle accidents, death by alcohol, death with a mention of drug use, and death due to external causes. So they're actually mainly going to focus on this motor vehicle accident, but I think they do include estimations for all types of external. So this is their reduced form estimate that they will use. So we have our outcome variable. So YAI is an outcome measure for individual I at age A, and then XAI represents the set of characteristics for individual I at age A, right? So that's just the vector of covariates. And then gy of A is the smooth function representing the age profile of the outcome. So this would be like a low order polynomial. This is the function that we've been talking about, how there's some initial relationship between our running variable and our outcome. So we said there's going to be some relationship between poverty index and whatever the outcome is, or the test score and completing college. So that's always going to be there. And then aside from that, we have a dummy variable, which is equal to 1 if you're older than 21 years, or equal or older. And so that'll be the basically cutoff effect. And then this is the error term. So yeah, this pi y, which is attached to the dummy variable for being older than, equal or older to 21, we'll measure any discrete changes in the expectation of our outcome that occurs precisely at age 21. So it's our causal parameter of interest. So let y denote the population mean of the outcome variable y in H cell A. Right, so they're using basically population average outcomes for mortality. That's why they do this. And so they're going to use just within, so for YA, so for the outcome for age A, it's going to be, that's just what I said, the expected outcome for YAI, given that your age for individual I is equal to A. So that will be the population average for all individuals within this age group. And this is just the population averages. So here you can see, oh wait, what? Yeah, so here they're using a parametric specification because this function is going to be parameterized with some polynomials. And then they also use a non-parametric specification using local linear regression. And so they'll choose a bandwidth size to find the window of comparability that we've talked about. Okay, we're definitely not going to finish this. So I think let's stop here and we'll go through the results on Wednesday, if that's fine with you guys. Okay. Let's do that then. Okay, so have a good night, everyone. I'll see you on Wednesday. You can always email me if you have any questions. Bye.